does working through an autonomy, equality, and nervous system lens actually help my PDA child or teen over the long term? This is an amazing question. It's an important question. And today I'm going to provide a free training answering this question with two primary topics: the theory of change over the long term for your child's well-being, mental and physical health, and nervous system health. Hi, everybody. Welcome. And what we mean by radical acceptance and how it relates to the theory of change over the long term for your child. So today, this is the fifth in a series of 6 clarity workshops, and these are meant to help parents understand and determine for themselves whether or not a autonomy, equality, and nervous system focused lens to parenting and caregiving is the right fit for their family, and whether or not they are ready to join the Paradigm Shift program, which opens to the wait list only on this Wednesday at noon Eastern, which I'm really excited about. So we're going to start with theory of change, radical acceptance. Then we're going to have a Q&A, which will be on that topic. And then I do have some questions that were submitted by waitlisters, and I'm going to start with those. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm so happy to see your faces and your waves and your hashtags and all of that. I'm going to start with a story from my own life to start illustrating this concept. Okay, so when my son hit burnout, which I did not understand as such, when he was approximately the age of 4.5, when we were living in Washington, D.C., I did not know what to do, and I was desperate. I had gone through the 1, 2, 3 magic, the times out, the positive discipline. I had been, for the past couple years, been hearing from the pediatrician how I needed to cook home-cooked meals, that I shouldn't be working so much, and that's why my son wasn't eating. I know, I was like, how is this happening? That I needed to be more consistent in my approach to my parenting, and that was the reason he was so oppositional and defiant. And I was really reaching a breaking point at the point where he was behaving as if he were a feral animal, and I was actually scared of him. Like, I would, even though he was only 4.5, I would take my then newborn baby and run out into the street while my husband stayed behind to try and de-escalate things. But I couldn't leave the room even for a second to go to the bathroom, or I'd have to bring my baby with me, because the first couple times this happened, I would come back and he was had a pillow over the face of my newborn, or was trying to scratch his eyeballs, etc. Okay, so this was a pretty extreme situation. And I had reached out to a dear friend from college who is a DIR floor time trained play therapist who works with children with learning differences and disabilities and autistic children. So she was I didn't know anything about sensory processing disorders. I had never heard the term self-regulation. I didn't know what occupational therapists or speech language pathologists did. I didn't even really fully understand what she did, but she was look, come to Chicago, stay with my family. I'm going to hook you up with an evaluation with these colleagues of mine that I really trust, and we're going to figure out some more clarity for your family, okay? And I was scared to even take my son on a plane. I remember I packed all of these Band-Aids because he would always have these ailments or illnesses or get hurt even though nothing was happening. So I had a whole first aid kit, and it was my go-to of here's a Band-Aid, right? So I went to see her. We went to see an occupational therapist. They did an evaluation for about 2.5 hours, and I remember distinctly he got into this hammock swing for a long time, and he sort of wouldn't get out of the hammock swing, and the speech pathologist prompted me very gently, why don't you get in there with him? Which is not something I would have thought of because my intuition was obscured by all of the trauma of not knowing how to interact with him. So I got in, and he put his cheek against my face, and my face was against his, and the therapist pointed that out, look at that co-regulation. It was the first time I'd heard that term as well, right? I know many of you probably started out from scratch with all this stuff. I mean, I certainly did. This was not my area of expertise or interest. But one of the most powerful things that weekend with my dear friend was actually watching her parent her son, who was around the same age, and she was using a non-behavioral approach. She had been in, as a professional, the autism space since before she even graduated from high school, okay? And she had started out her career in applied behavioral therapy and in a residential facility, and really had been steeped in that dimension of therapy for autism, right? And she took a turn, realized that this, regardless of PDA, was not aligned with her values, and went the direction of DIR floor time, which is developmental individual differences based and relationship based. So it's like another school of thought. And she applied a lot of this parenting to her own son, where it was not rewards and consequences, no punishment, lots of co-regulation. And it was just, my mind was kind of blown, because I was like, oh, there's a different way to do this, right? I wasn't on social media or anything. I wasn't following gentle parenting. I just didn't even know that this was a concept. And I was like, wow, okay. And so I observed her, and she taught me, and I asked all these questions as the academic that I was, and she gave me books, etc., one of which was The Explosive Child and Tilt Parenting and all the things. So I came home from Chicago and told my husband, we are no longer doing timeouts, rewards and consequences or sanctions. We're going to be doing co-regulation, and we're going to be doing, a safe sensory corner. And he was just kind of like, okay, what? Because I had been so all in and on trying to be consistent with the traditional parenting stuff because of the pediatricians for 2 years, right? And I remember standing in the kitchen with my husband trying to explain, and he was like, but what's the theory of change, Casey? What will this get us, and where are we going? Is this actually what we're supposed to do in the face, hi everybody, of my son screaming and throwing things at our face and locking us in the basement like he did with my husband, and hitting and screaming? So he was like, what's the theory of change? And I remember my face flushing and feeling my own activation, because as an academic and someone who's worked in academic settings and is very pro research, I did not have a theory of change. Okay. I was just intuitively, this feels like a different approach. We can experiment. I just need you to get on board. And he did, of course, and now we can laugh about it. But at that point, I did not have a theory of change. And so I have spent the last 4+ years scouring the literature and patterns and understanding of trauma and the polyvagal theory and child brain development and all of that, to develop a theory of change that underlies the approach that I teach parents, okay? So it's not, I want to be really clear that it's not a parenting philosophy, and I feel strongly about that, because I feel like there's a connotation of a right or wrong way, whereas really we're here to understand what works for your child's unique brain, and even within the PDA community, that's going to be different. Okay, so I want to talk to you about this theory of change, which underpins the work that I do, because I think, especially for more logically minded, linear thinkers, potentially the dads who are not quite on board, this can be very helpful to understand the deep why behind what you're doing and what the long game is, okay? Because in the short term and in the moment, it's going to feel very paradoxical to you and like it's the wrong thing to do, okay? So let's first talk about the root cause of what is provoking your child's behavior, quote, behavior that you see on the surface. Okay, so for most of you, you're here because your child is avoidant. They avoid demands, but also because you see fight, flight, or freeze behavior, although you might not be looking at it through that lens. What you see is, or experience sensorially yourself or physically, is screaming, hitting, biting, growling, hissing, throwing things, breaking things, slamming on doors with heads and legs and feet and hands, etc. Okay? That's the fight. Then there's the flight, which is like, I'm running away from you. I'm running away from you in the back of the car. I'm going to kick you if you come close to me. If you have a teenager, this is going to look a little bit different. It might be more verbal, but you might have them walk away from you, ignore you. You know, for younger kids, walking on the edges of windowsills, on the tops of couches, on the tops of cars when they're avoiding you or going places that they don't want to go. And then you have freeze, which can range from like crying, going into a turtle shell, selective mutism, disassociation, they're not there, lethargy, etc. Okay, so that's like some of the surface level behavior that we see and understand. And what's that related to? That in and of itself is not behavior in the sense of like they are premeditating this behavior, which it can look like they are, but it's not. It's happening on a survival level. Okay, so what's happening in the brain? And I have my little brain picture for you. Okay, so all of us have the limbic system and the amygdala is within it, and that's the part of the brain that perceives whether you're safe or not. Okay, and that part of the brain operates a lot faster than the thinking part of your brain, which is the frontal lobe. In the frontal lobe, that's where we empathize, it's where we have our like sequencing, rational thought, understanding cause and effect, learning, etc. Okay, so all of us have these two parts of the brain. What's unique about a PDA brain is that what activates this survival mechanism is not necessarily needing to be a hurricane, a lion chasing you, getting held up in a dark alley, neglect, abuse, car crash, which is something that would activate any of our nervous systems. And if we have more sensitive nervous systems because we're neurodivergent, anxious by genetics, we're going to have more sensitivity there, but not necessarily, unless you're PDA, the root cause of whenever the subconscious, automatic, before your frontal lobe catches up, perceives that you have lost autonomy, freedom and choice, or equality to you or someone around you, that is what's going to precipitate that nervous system mechanism, which then leads to the fight, flight, freeze. Okay, so when we see the fight, flight, freeze, that is what's happening externally, what we can observe. But what's going on in the body, every time that limbic system is perceiving on a subconscious level, I've lost autonomy, equality, freedom, choice, it's telling the nervous system, we have to stay alive. Okay, even though there's no actual lion, it's like we have to stay alive. Okay, so if we're going to fight, flight, the brain is telling the body, release adrenaline, release cortisol, blood rushes to the extremities so you can run or fight, right? Metabolism speeds up. You want to get all the fluids and excess out of your body if you're going to run or fight. So there might be diarrhea, there might be digestive issues, there might be vomiting. My son vomits. And when I'm anxious, I have to go to the bathroom, right? It's just part of our survival drive. Okay, so that's what's happening physiologically every single time the brain is perceiving those losses of autonomy or equality. If your child has a more internalized expression, it might be more freeze, which is a different physiological response. It may be endorphins are releasing because it's more of a shock state, right? And if the child gets bit by the lion, you don't want to feel all the pain. You're like playing dead, but it's a survival response. Again, like none of this is happening in the like, they're doing this to get X. Like they want attention, or they're doing this because they know I'll respond in this way, or, you know, they're trying to get their needs met in this inappropriate way, or there's this like avoidant attachment or anxious attachment and they're like seeking attention. Like none of that is happening. That's never what you would say to a person who was, you know, held up in a dark alley with a gun. You wouldn't be like, oh, they're attention seeking with that screaming right there, right? And I'll give you a story from my own life, and I often think about this in order to help me understand my son in the difficult moments, because all of us have moments where we're like, how can this possibly be a reflexive subconscious response, right? So when I used to travel in my former life, I did a lot of work in Latin America, and I was in the subway after, like, at the end of the subway lines schedule with my friend traveling in Argentina, and we were alone on the platform, and we got held up at knife point by two male individuals trying to take our purses. What did I do? I didn't think about it. I just started screaming, hitting, pulling my purse, kicking, etc. My best friend started laughing, right? Neither of us thought about it. It just happened. And we ended up running and getting out of their flight without getting hurt. And afterwards, we were both like shaky, and like our bodies were just doing the physiological things that bodies do after the body has perceived, like, I'm going to die. Okay. And I remember her reflecting, like, why did I laugh? Like, she was so mad at herself. And I was like, I didn't even think about what I did. Like, you didn't either. It was just a survival response. And I know some of you, because you've asked, and I've seen it with my own son, you're like, why are they laughing right now? But it's just like a survival response. Okay. So imagine for a second that this is happening to the body and in the brain, not just when you're in a subway station in Argentina or getting in a car crash or, you know, being held up at gunpoint or whatever it is that's setting off your survival response. What if, as a child or a teen, every time you're not allowed to have a choice, or you feel like someone is putting themselves above you as an authority figure or in stature or composure or power, that your brain subconsciously is going to tell your body like you're going to die, and it responds as such? Okay? That's a lot of times, right? Even if you don't see it as a parent, often it's internalized. It's internalized and comes out later, which is where the masking dynamic comes in of like, well, they seem fine at school, but then they come home and there's these explosive meltdowns or equalizing behavior that's really difficult to manage. So what happens over time when not only is the child or teen perceiving this danger on a subconscious level and perhaps and likely not understanding why their body's doing that or why they're responding in that way, it builds and builds and builds over time. It accumulates, okay? So I'm going to use my water bottle. Gotta stay hydrated. As an example of this, okay? So we all have our threshold of content. So, sorry, I just read someone's message, love your content. So I said threshold of content. This is why I can't look at the messages until the end, because I get distracted. Okay, so threshold of tolerance. So all of us have that, the point at which we get activated over and over and over again, and then we hit the point where it's too much for our bodies, it's too much for our psyche, and we just start to experience trauma. Okay, so all of us have that, but not all of us have the neuroception that's telling us we're in danger all the time. So what happens, and this is also why some of these children and teens, it feels like as a parent it comes on all of a sudden. You're like, did my child become PDA? Can you become PDA? Did they have an autistic regression? It's because of this cumulative aspect. Okay, so imagine when they're younger, every time they have this activation, it's like building towards the threshold, but they're not there yet. And depending on how we respond, if you responded like me, you're going to be moving towards the threshold quicker, because I responded with more behavioral approaches, which was loss of autonomy, loss of equality, over and over and over again. If you're a gentle parent, an intuitive parent by nature, maybe they weren't moving so fast towards the threshold until they got to school, right? And then they're down here, but they go to school and it pushes them past their threshold, and it's like, oh, right? Or they got an autism diagnosis and maybe they were down here, but then they go into behavioral therapy and it's building. Okay, so what does that do? What does that do when we push the child past the threshold of tolerance? It means they're operating from this part of their brain most of the time, right? So remember what we said. This part of the brain cannot access learning, cannot access empathy, cannot access rational thought. And so a lot of times we think these kids have lower skills than they do, and that their developmental timeline, it might be delayed according to like neurotypical timelines, or it might be that they just can't access the frontal lobe because they're spending so much time in their limbic system, right? Like a traumatized individual with PTSD would. Okay, so if we know this mechanism, if we know the root cause, we know the mechanism. Root cause, autonomy and equality losses in the neuroception. Mechanism, the same as trauma. Nervous system response, fight, flight, freeze. And then we know about neuroplasticity and what happens in these parts of the brain. And like an intro level book that you can read about this. I didn't invent it. Read Dr. Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson's Whole Brain Child as a starting point. What happens is our kids are in the downstairs brain or the survival brain or the limbic system most of the time. And we're continuing to respond to them with things that are making them more and more entrenched into the limbic system. Okay, so of course, we're going to feel like they've had a regression. We're going to feel like they have no empathy. We're going to feel like they have no skills. And unfortunately, what do? We seek out therapy and we seek out solutions, which often drive them further into the limbic system. What do we do about this? Okay, and this is when we take a different path. And it feels radical, but it's actually based in brain science, which is like the whole point is how can we get our children out of the limbic system and back to their frontal lobe so they can access rational thought, learning, movement, accessing basic needs, all the things they need to have a life where they can thrive. Okay, but it's a long-term approach because wherever you are in your journey, all of you, and I'm not saying this to fault you at all, it's just, of course, you didn't know until they hit their threshold, right, that they were PDA. But we have to undo this cumulative nervous system activation. We have to start accommodating the root cause to lower the cumulative nervous system activation. So that's not changing their brain in the sense that they're not PDA. It just means through an accommodation approach of really looking at that root cause of equality and autonomy and nervous system safety, that even though they may activate when there's a no, a boundary, a difficult moment, they're not going to be in constant fight, flight, freeze, or not be able to access their basic needs like toileting independently, eating, sleeping through the night, safety, and hygiene, right? But what we have to do is really hone in on the granular day-to-day, moment-to-moment choice point that each of us have every moment, which is the radical acceptance piece, and I'm going to get to that. So over time, every interaction, and I don't want this to feel like pressure, I want this to feel like an opportunity, because it's cumulative. It's not about perfection, of just like every time we have this choice point of how we can respond. We can either accommodate and move them to the frontal lobe in that moment, or we can drive them, unfortunately, deeper into the limbic system. But the good news is that over and over and over again, every time we accommodate, what are we doing? We're creating and strengthening a neural pathway back to the frontal lobe over and over and over again. Okay, we're also developing trust, felt safety and trust and connection. So not about emotions, actually feeling safe in their bodies around us, which is also what will facilitate long-term collaboration and problem solving. Right? But like, for example, you can't just jump right into collaborative problem solving, which is an awesome tool. Like, I love Ross Greene. He's amazing. I read The Explosive Child. I love his work. But if they're down here, we can't use the tool, right? Like they're not able to learn. They're not able to collaboratively problem solve. Potentially, we're employing the scripts of plan A, B, and C, using direct questions. And what do direct questions do? Loss of autonomy and equality. Maybe we're coming into their room and being like, hey, I want to collaboratively problem solve with you. What is that perceived in the brain? A loss of autonomy and equality, right? So it's not that these are not great tools. It's just that we first have to start with like, where is your child in terms of where they are in their brain? And sometimes it takes years to like strengthen that neural pathway. So what happens when they're back in their frontal lobe? They can learn, they can empathize, they can access the skills that you didn't think that they had. I mean, it depends on the kid. Like, some have other things going on. Some might have more, higher social communication needs and therefore more like traditionally or typically autistic, but we can't necessarily address those well to support them until they're back in this part of the brain, right? And this is why I don't think of therapy as a binary, because it's not. Like, should I do therapy and what therapy? It depends. Like, it depends on, are you a year into the accommodation approach and you can actually use collaborative problem solving to talk about what they want to work on because they're most of the time in the frontal lobe and you have this trust developed? I mean, or around medication or whatever. This is the precursor to that, okay? So you're like, okay, Casey, that sounds great. Let's do it. How do I do it? Of course. So that is exactly what I try and put on social media, but it's a comprehensive approach. So it's like a reel's not going to cut it. I mean, of course, you can like DIY by going through all my tiles and TikToks and podcasts and YouTubes. However, the Paradigm Shift program is designed to give you the foundation of this approach, okay? To actually get you the tools you need to implement this long term. So let's talk about briefly here, though, what do we mean by implementation? Because often parents are on board until it comes to implementation. This is for me too, because you're faced in the moment with the trade-offs, okay? Because so often, much of what we're doing here, it's like there's a cost. It's a cost to the kid or it's a cost to you, and it feels like robbing Peter to pay Paul. So let's talk about implementation. I want you to ask yourself, are you actually implementing on a day-to-day moment radical acceptance and accommodation? Not just lowering demands, but honing in on the true root cause of activation, which is autonomy, equality, and nervous system. Okay, I've got my little notes here. What you're doing designed specifically to move them out of the limbic system over and over and over again? And are you consistent, or is our conditioning getting in the way? And for me, I have to confront this question all the time. This is not like me as a guru being like, I know better than you. It's like I'm constantly thinking through, like, is that the fear talking, Casey, or are you remembering the logic of this long-term approach and what you've seen with your coaching clients and your own son? I have a very privileged viewpoint with a bird's eye view because I have witnessed hundreds of parents move through this journey. But if I hadn't, it would be more based on a leap of faith, right? So let's talk about radical acceptance, because this is a key component. And often when we talk about radical acceptance, it's like, well, of course I accept my kid, but that's not that radical. What I'm talking about is in the moment accommodations. Okay, so let's talk about examples. When I post things that I actually do in my home, which are based on de-escalation and moving my child back to the frontal lobe, I always get a ton of like, you're teaching them that they can act like that, right? You're teaching them to be abusive. You're teaching them X, Y, and Z. And it's like all of a sudden parents are triggered and they're forgetting this logic of like, they're not learning anything. They're here. I'm just using an accommodation in the moment to get them back here so that we can solve the problem. And lower nervous system activation. Okay, so let's get through these examples. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is radically accept that you have a choice point. And I cannot change this and you cannot change this, which is you are always activating or accommodating your child. You're either driving them deeper into the limbic system or towards the frontal lobe. There's no in between. Okay, so in the moments, like for example, when your child says like, you're a bitch, what's the first thing you're going to do? You're going to get activated. No judgment. Of course you are, because you're spending your whole life trying to figure out how to support your kid. You've probably made all these sacrifices and they're criticizing you. What's your conditioning going to tell you? And your instinct. I need to tell them they can't act like that. I need to teach them so that they don't continue to do this outside of the home. Okay? But then we're forgetting. You can correct them, absolutely. Like, you can correct them, you can give them a punishment, you can set a boundary, but what's going to happen? And this I can't change, and this is triggering because this is the radical acceptance piece. If you do that, it will drive them back down here. That's how the disability works, okay? So what's the alternative? De-escalation, accommodation. In implementation, it feels very uncomfortable to say, like, yeah, it sounds like, you're having a hard time with my parenting. Or just like, let it go, right? That's not a natural response as a parent. That would be a diffusion accommodation. But what happens when parents are confronted with that example? You get triggered. You want to argue with me, right? And the reason you get triggered and want to argue with me is because you're actually wanting to argue with your child's disability. You don't want it to be like that. And I don't either. I don't wish that my child had this trade-off of like, if I stop him from hurting his little brother, there will be a cost to his nervous system and he will activate. That doesn't mean I don't still set a boundary, but like in accumulation, there are many times when I choose to accommodate because I know about the threshold of tolerance, because I know about the long game. And I will say, I do go back based on the trust that we've built over years and discuss it when he's in a regulated moment in the frontal lobe. But it's all happening in the moment, right? When we're getting activated and we're not wanting to radically accept that trade-off, that choice point, right? So it's not this like in the ether, are you neurodiversity affirming and do you accept your child? And if you struggle with anything, that you're not radically accepting them. No, you're accepting the trade-off, okay? And this is where parents get stuck. Let me give you some more examples. Yesterday, my son is on the couch asking for Pirate's Booty. He's like, I want Pirate's Booty. So I'm like, okay, I'll go get you some Pirate's Booty. Grab it, bring it to him. I said I wanted popcorn. What's our instinct? To correct, right? To say, no, you said you wanted Pirate's Booty. I want to teach him he can't lie and he can't change. He can't like treat me like a maid and all the things. But like, again, I can't teach him anything in that moment just because of the way his brain works. So I have to make a decision of like, am I going to use this moment? Is this moment important enough for me to activate his nervous system? Or is it based on what I call a fear cost? Okay, so I teach parents to think through and make decisions and practice through what's called a cost-benefit decision-making framework. And often where parents get stuck is when they're trying to discern, not in the heat of the moment, how to accommodate and actually do this, they get lost in the fear cost. Okay, so like for example, in the moment with this popcorn and Pirate's Booty, the fear cost, if I weren't being discerning with myself, the fear cost of not correcting him is if I don't correct him now, he will continue to talk to me like this, and then he will continue to treat others in his life like that and be abusive to women. He'll never have a partner of any sort. He'll never be independent or operate independently in the world, and I'll have to continue serving him Pirate's Booty and popcorn until the end of time. Okay? That's the fear cost of like, if this happens, then this, then this, then this, then this. Rather than just honing in on the moment, which is like, okay, what's the true cost of me setting a boundary or correcting him? The true cost, his nervous system activates, and depending on where his threshold is, he might be getting close to not being able to eat at all. That's the true cost. And the benefit of me accommodating him is that he might be more likely to eat and stay away from his threshold and away from like equalizing behavior in the future or towards his sibling. Okay? And of course there's a cost to me, which is, if I'm not viewing it correctly for myself of like, my own activation and my own like self-doubt. But at this point, I just see it as data. I'm just like, oh, data, his nervous system's activated. I'm not going to correct him. It just tells me more about where he is with his threshold of tolerance. I don't take it personally. Okay, which takes practice over time. That's something we learn through either the Progress with PDA workshop or the Paradigm Shift program. It's just data. Okay, so parents often get lost in the fear cost, but the tool is meant to bring you intensely into the present moment, and the paradigm shift gives you an opportunity to actually practice this over the long term in a group of other parents doing the same thing. Okay, so another example is like when they tell you it's your fault, when they spill a cup across the room, or when you walk by them and they make a mistake on a video game and they start screaming at you, right? Again, we have to radically accept the choice point of like, I can accommodate or I can activate. And like, you want to do the thing that will activate them because you're frustrated and you're human, right? And this is why it takes practice. But at its core, it's radically accepting that you only have two pathways. And the child only has two pathways or parts of their brain that we're able to deal with, right? And that sucks to have to accept, because there are so many trade-offs and difficulties, and it goes against a lot of our conditioning about what it means to be a good parent. Okay? So as parents move through either a coaching container with me or a paradigm shift program, there are other places that we use the concept of radical acceptance. So I want to break it down for you guys because I think this is a very powerful concept. And I'm going to illustrate this with an example from my own life. Okay, so here's my truth. I really don't like playing with kids. I don't like it. I don't like playing with my own kids. I don't like playing with other people's kids. I find it tedious, boring, and like my mind goes a million different directions, and it's hard for me to stay present, and then I feel bad about myself and guilty, and I'm like, holy shit, I'm a parent coach, and like I'm supposed to like be helping other parents, play with their kids. However, what I see this sensation as, my own nervous system activation, the thoughts in my head that I just described to you, and the emotions associated with, of like, that's just part of the human experience. These are just bubbling up, and I can see it. I can observe myself of like, okay, like I don't like playing with kids. I get jittery and a little manic myself, and that's what's happening in my body. And then I feel shame because my whole job is to help parents. Like, one of the things I do is help parents learn how to play with their kids. And I notice it and I don't avoid it, right? But I also don't identify with it of like, I'm a bad person, I'm a fraud, I guess I just suck at playing, so I'm going to give up on it. I see it, I let it pass and let it move through. I radically accept and bring loving kindness to that aspect of my human experience. That's what I want you to do for yourself as well, right? And once we accept that, it's like, okay, I don't like playing. Does that mean I'm not going to play? Does that mean I'm not going to like spend hours on the floor playing the same train game with the same kid over and over and over again? Of course not. But instead of avoiding it or hating myself, I just name and observe exactly what's going on in my body, emotions, and thoughts. And this is like from the Buddhist practice of like, observe without judgment and then bring loving kindness to it. We let go of avoidance, but we also let go of grasping of like, this is my identity and I'm sticking with it, right? So like a tool I've developed based on this awareness of myself is I set my Fitbit for 10-minute increments. I view it as a spiritual practice, and I set it for 10 minutes, and I'm like, I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes totally focused and engaged on my child. And I am going to like look at his eyelashes and the way that his little cheeks move as he's telling me about the same little boxcar 100 times, right? And it's harder when you have a child who's activated and dysregulated, but I use the same technique, right? When I was with my son, my older PDA son, it might be 3 minutes at a time, right? And then it buzzes and I do another 3 minutes. Okay, so it's not about, often when parents come into my world or my containers, or programs, it's like they're finally ready to stop avoiding. But where things can get sticky, and I'm not going to let you get stuck, is like, okay, now we're not avoiding this grief and rage and resentment, but we're going to stay in it. We're going to hold on to it and grasp onto it and identify with it. We're all going to get negative and like just make this who we are, right? But I'm not going to create a scenario for you guys where that's going to be the vibe. I want you guys to allow, bring loving kindness, and move, right? We're going to move through it. So you can stop avoiding, but you can also have the tools to not grasp and identify with it, which is what allows you to create more space for creativity and problem solving outside of what you can't change, which is also often what we focus on, right? Like if I just spent all my time being like, Casey, you suck as a person, like you need to make yourself like playing, I would get stuck in not actually playing, right? Okay, so where does this come out when I'm working with families? The like examples of radical acceptance where it's like maybe you stop avoiding or denying that something is the way that it is, but then getting stuck in it, okay? Places parents get stuck, and I've gotten stuck in all these places, and I'm speaking from experience, so this is not a judgment of you, and I still struggle with this, and this is why I do so much Buddhist meditation of like practicing this stuff, right? So you get stuck in the shoulds, right? My child's nervous system should not be this way. I shouldn't have to make a trade-off between correcting my child for calling me a bitch and their nervous system activating to the point where it disables them. Like, yeah, it shouldn't be that way. We shouldn't have to make those decisions, but we do, right? It's like, I can't change that. You can't change that. That's part of the radical acceptance. And I say this shit to myself too. It's like, and I'll say it to my husband and he'll say it to me, and then we'll catch ourselves and we'll move. We'll move out of the stuckness because I've trained myself to do this of like, it shouldn't be so hard. I shouldn't have to separate the kids. He should be able to listen to me when I say stop equalizing against William and destroying his things. But then he activates and he fixates and he does it, right? If I didn't accept that, I would still be trying to like force them to be together, right? Where else? My partner won't get on board. How do I make them get on board? The school should be accommodating. My parents or the grandparents should understand this. I've explained it a million times. I shouldn't feel this way. I know they have a disability. Why am I having such a hard time? Okay, so these are all examples of like, it just is, right? It's hard, it's unfair, it's difficult, but when we can radically accept what's true right now, we can actually stop spending all of our energy trying to change something we can't and start to see the possibilities and transcend the limitations towards change that will actually get you unstuck. Okay? So as you may be gathering through this, the brain science, the Buddhism, the theory of change, and then the radical acceptance, my approach and the Paradigm Shift program might not be for everyone at every stage of their journey, okay? Like for me, at the very beginning of my journey, I might have been too triggered to like go into this program because I would have been wanting to stay in the like, yeah, but I hate my life and I'm not going to do this and all the things. Like I have been in that stage. So I just want to say that like, maybe this is your seed, right? Like maybe a year from now, you'll feel more resourced to take these action steps. But if you are feeling, wherever you are, if you're new to PDA or have been in a journey for 10 years and have an older teen PDAer, and you feel ready to get unstuck, you feel ready to learn the tools to experiment and find your own path through the dark woods that you're experiencing, I want to invite you into this next cohort of the Paradigm Shift program, which will be opening for enrollment on Wednesday at noon for the waitlist only. Okay, if there is still room on the waitlist, I will open it up on the 11th to the public. Okay, so that being said, I'm going to go right to the Q&A, which will be specific to theory of change and radical acceptance, so brain science and Buddhism, or the logistics and specifics of the Paradigm Shift program. So I'm going to read the first question from a waitlister. Okay, how likely is it I will get into the program? Okay, so last time I capped it at 100 families and never opened it to the public, so not everyone even on the wait list got a spot. However, I am going to be increasing the amount of families that can be included. I've hired 2 other coaches to support me in the community. And I think it's very likely if you purchase before August 11th, if you are on the wait list, that you will get a spot. You don't need to be in front of the computer at noon on Wednesday, refreshing your browser like you're trying to get a spot in preschool in New York City. It's not like that, but if you are interested, I wouldn't wait a long time because it is going to be capped. All right, so the next question is about radical acceptance. I have a lot of fears about prognosis and ability to be healthy and independent as our 9-year-old currently in burnout grows up. How does the brain's development play into widening his window of tolerance and independent self-regulation as he ages? Okay, so I like to parse the self-regulation concept from the nervous system activation, okay? Because what's happening is a nervous system response based on subconscious perception. So that's not about has the child learned to self-soothe? It's they actually have this nervous system activation going off all the time. If they have a window that we've developed through an accommodation approach, then when they do activate, they're not going to tip over into a space where they're just hanging out permanently in the amygdala and limbic system and at risk of trauma. Okay? So developmentally, something parents ask me is will they grow out of it as they get more self-awareness and they're moving from 5 to 7 to 10, and there's normal developmental stages or typical developmental stages where children are more capable of understanding and conceptualizing their own behavior and the role they play in it, etc. However, what happens with PDA kids who are not accommodated is it doesn't matter how old they are. They can be teens and they're hanging out here. So even if typically with their development, they would have had a more developed frontal lobe or more access to certain developmental stages, just like a really severely traumatized brain, if you're hanging out here, it doesn't matter your developmental stage because you can't access the part of the brains that are rational, empathetic, self-reflective, etc. Okay, so that is why we use this accommodation approach. And I know the question you have of well, what if I can't accommodate them forever? What if I'm not there 10 years from now? And I get that, it's a fear I've had too, but the way that we work through this is the more you can keep them in the frontal lobe, the more they can learn to manage their own disability, the more that they can understand their own nervous system activation and learn how to accommodate themselves so they don't reach these points that are disabling. Okay, so that's part of the theory of change. For this specific question, the fears about prognosis and ability to be healthy and independent, I don't know if that refers to the mom or the 9-year-old, because I think it could refer to either. But I think one of the things I support parents with is let's stay focused on the present moment and do exactly what we can do, what we have control over, and not focus on the uncertainty, because all we have is right now, this present moment, and based on the theory of change, we're moving in the right direction. And of course, if this isn't resonating for you, that doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means this isn't the right approach or necessarily the neurotype that your child has. But we have to confront the conditioning of well, the accommodations, though, that we're applying to get them into their frontal lobe are going against all of the suggestions from the pediatricians, therapists, educators based on rewards and sanctions, right? So we have to confront that with clear eyes, and that's what we're doing here, because you're going to have the voice in your head that's I'm doing this wrong and I'm actually setting them up for failure. But when we go back to the brain science, we can actually understand we're not conditioning, we're not not good parents, we're actually teaching them to manage their disability through our modeling of it. But the modeling from the outside looking in can look like lenient parenting and not being deliberate and mindful, which is the furthest thing from the truth, in my opinion. But again, we're not focused on what other people think of us. We're focused on what we know to be true to support our children's long-term mental health, physical health, well-being, and family stability. Because that's what matters, right? Like, it doesn't matter how well they read if your family's falling apart and they don't want to get up in the morning, right? Okay, you mentioned in the last live, and thanks to the course, some families discover that actually their kiddo does not have PDA and or those methods don't work well for them. We don't have any formal diagnoses yet, but I wanted to participate in the course. I was wondering if things we learn can be helpful in getting the correct diagnoses. Has anybody used it in that way for the previous cohorts? Okay, so these are a lot of different questions. Let me address the first one. Okay, so I've never had a family come through the course or coaching and determine that their child doesn't have PDA, but I have had one or two in the hundreds of families I've worked with in coaching who determined that there was more than one thing going on, right? Which is part of getting clarity. And this can happen, right? Where part of what's driving the behavior is that neuroception around autonomy, equality, and the nervous system activation. But the other part of the brain is like OCD and sticky. And so you have two different root causes. Both can be true at the same time, or maybe there's other things like PANS or PANDAS or trauma or other things. And so they've done the PDA approach and it hasn't gotten their child to the point that they want the child to be at, right? So, and there's nothing wrong with this, of like, now we see the OCD much more clearly. And so we're going to actually prioritize more exposure at this point. We're going to prioritize a little bit more behavioral approaches because perhaps the OCD was driving it more than the PDA, or we want to experiment with a different approach because my child is still violent. And, you know, the accommodations helped in some degrees, but this OCD and severe anxiety we think is driving it more, and so we're gonna go more the exposure and behavioral direction. Okay, and so it's sequential. It doesn't mean that like I've never had a family who was like, this wasn't helpful, because part of what I'm teaching you is to tune out other people's opinions and tune into the data of your child, which is a skill beyond neurotype and diagnosis, right? It's like teaching you to observe objectively yourself and your child without judgment and with compassion, track indicators that you care about, not what people are telling you need to care about, but like indicators of connection, basic needs, access, and trust. And then making decisions based on that. And so not every family is going to make the same decisions, right? And that, I think, is a positive outcome because it means you're tuning into your own intuition and data. And that's the point. So it's okay if you don't have any diagnoses. Totally doesn't matter if you have a formal PDA diagnosis. It's whether or not you believe that this is the right approach for your family. But we do have lessons and PDFs that are specifically there to help you advocate for the diagnosis that is helpful for your family. The language to use, there's a module on like advocacy, nonviolent communication, boundaries, pruning, etc. And there is specific language and structure around how to advocate and even how to approach getting an autism diagnosis, because often with these children, like, they're not going to get the autism diagnosis, but you often need that, depending on the country that you're in, to access insurance coverage, financial resources, the ability to advocate at school for a special education plan, etc. So it is a very important point, but this is like the logic. It's not first diagnosis, people telling me what to do, and then I take action. I'm taking action based on what I think as a parent, and then I'm going to get the tools I need in order to get the diagnosis in a strategic way. So it's a mindset shift. It's like not looking externally for like an MD or a PhD to be like, this is what your child has. It's like, regardless, you're going to experiment and collect data and determine what helps your child. Okay? So, next question. I've realized I'm intuitively making many of the accommodations mentioned. Awesome. For me, it seems to be working and helpful. Very good. However, it's hard for my husband to tolerate how my daughter does whatever she wants and witnessing the way she treats me. I have to say she can be very nasty and hurtful, mostly towards me, because you're the safe person, and it's equalizing against you. Only rarely does she lose it in the presence of other people. Very common. Okay. I know you'll be addressing the topic in the course, and my husband will participate as well. But what if after the course he's not convinced and will refuse to parent using this approach? Okay, so I'm doing everything at my disposal and like in a subtle way to design this so that co-parents can autonomously come to their own conclusions. And I think for many dads especially, the theory of change, the logic, the scientific method that we use can be very supportive of them getting on board. We also focus on what we can control and what we can't control. And we focus on the present moment. So I would encourage you to experiment, if you're going to be in the course, to experiment with letting go of your partner's trajectory and really focus on what you can control and your own participation in the program. And that often is like a strewed example that can facilitate a partner learning more on their own timeline, because often, not always, sometimes co-parents or partners have their own neurodivergence or need for autonomy, and that can make it harder for them to get on board at the same pace that you do. Okay. Let's see. Do you have examples from coaching where parents are not aligned? 100%. I mean, that's like a given. I would say it's very uncommon for me. As I started this live, you heard my story of like, I was at a different place than my husband. It's very uncommon for me to start a coaching container with a family that doesn't at least have some differences between the parents in terms of who's on board, or to what degree, or to what level they have radically accepted. And sometimes it seems at first like they're on the same page. And I'll just tell you, like, I do an intake process separately with each parent because I love to compare their answers of like, how many hours a day does the child spend dysregulated, or like what are the strengths of the child? And I have each parent fill it out, and there's questions about the parent, and then I can see the differences between their perceptions, and that's like a key piece behind the scenes of like supporting the family. So I'll just say it is more common for me to see that than not, and I don't think that's anything that means like your family's not going to get to the place that they need to get to in terms of, supporting your child. Okay, so those are all the questions that got submitted, and I am going to take a quick moment to look at if there are any questions from you guys who joined live. Love to see you. Let's see. Will you be offering anything for the PDA in the adult population? No, I won't be. I am not PDA, and I feel like there are enough amazing individuals out there who either have clinical training or a lived experience of PDA to fill that space in a way that doesn't feel like it's my role. Like I feel like I'm very much an expert of working with parents, right? And parent patterns and parent dynamics and families and children. And I have that lived experience, and I can bring my academic prowess to from the outside looking in, parenting and supporting a PDA child. But the adult population outside of parenting is not my niche, I guess you could say, and I don't see myself moving into that space. You are so welcome. What about PDA parents activating their PDA kids? How do we move away from the power struggle and de-escalate self in order to de-escalate the child? Yeah, that's like, I would say about 10 to 15% of the parents I work with eventually through the process of either coaching or moving into the program start to realize that they're PDA. And so like we always talk about like starting with awareness. And then we really use the tools that I've discussed here of radical acceptance of like observation of oneself without judgment, and then bringing loving kindness and compassion to oneself as the first step in that practice, right? Because often, with the example I used about like, I don't like playing, right? Often we fight against these aspects of ourselves because they feel like they're wrong. Like I should like playing because I'm a parent coach and it's so important for my kids' mental health. But the truth of the matter is like, it is what it is. So the first step is like, are you fully aware, which it sounds like you are, and you're noting it, which is a great first step of like what your body's doing in certain moments and why, what the mechanisms are, what your brain's doing, what your body's doing. And then the next step is bringing that loving kindness and compassion of like this too, like this is part of my human experience. This is what my body does. And as we start allowing and observing, then we can start taking the next steps to, where we can shift things. We don't try and make ourselves not who we are or judge ourselves for that. So there will be a woman named Kendall in the program who was in the last cohort. I hired her to help specifically in the online community to support parents who are PDA identifying or exploring, neurolurking or curious. So she will be there to support those particular parents as they move through that awareness. I'm really excited to bring her on. Yeah, that is the fear. Yes, all of us have it. I love the 10-minute play technique. I hate playing too, and his PDA tendency to dictate all play is super triggering. Of course. Yeah, it is triggering. It's no fun when someone's like correcting every single thing you do and being like, no, you did it wrong, or like whatever. It's not fun. How much will you cover social skills learning for better communication with playmates? Not at all. I won't cover that because I don't teach skills. I'm not a clinician. What I'm focusing on is helping you accommodate your kids. So what I might tell you is like, stop focusing on that. Like, let's focus on getting them into the part of the brain where they can access their social communication skills and or observe others around them and felt safety, right? Because I think, an art therapist can help with social communication because they create an environment of autonomy and felt safety more than an SLP who is trying to force skills, even gently, of like, here's the skills that we're working on, or we're going to repeat these sounds, because it will just put them in the limbic system. So I want to be very clear that like that's not the approach that I do. It's actually very different than that, but I think that's why it can be transformational for families who are still thinking through the lens of like, well, how are you going to make sure that they learn these skills? Because we're actually putting the skills aside and prioritizing things like connection, basic needs access, and nervous system activation, and getting them over the long term, which might come at the expense of skills, learning skills, back into the frontal lobe. So it might mean putting social skills on the back burner. And that's not going to be the right fit for every family. They're going to be like, I don't want that. And that's great. I don't, like, my biggest fear for myself is like having someone purchase a program or come into a container, and it happens much less in the sense of like, I feel like I'm very clear in my content, but like, I do not want parents to not be in the right space for them. And I want them to feel supported and held and like they're on the right path. And I certainly don't want families to invest if it feels like they don't want that approach. So that's why I'm trying to do these lives with everybody and share very clearly what this program is about. Do you have any advice for a parent going into an IEP meeting and wanting to educate them just a little on PDA? You know what I might suggest, even though it's outside of the scope of this live, but it's an easy question. 2 things. If you haven't already, take the Clarity Masterclass, which is free because you have handouts there. Like, you have like the 5 characteristic framework of PDA. You can just hand it over to the IEP team. It's all free. Link in my bio. There's a $25 masterclass that's about school, and there's actually a PDF handout about how to advocate with teachers, with language you can use, etc. So those would be my first 2 starting points. Will you cover food demands? Our PDA barely accepts any food right now and only wants takeout. The problem is we can't afford takeout every day. It's causing so much stress in our child. Yeah, that sounds like a really difficult situation. So we will be discussing basic needs access, eating, in the context of PDA. There will be a guest expert who is a medical doctor and who is a feeding specialist with trauma-informed feeding specialist with children. Sorry, I'm losing my steam a little on the live because it's been an hour. And she will be talking to us about felt safety and trauma-informed approaches to eating with PDA children. So I'm really excited to bring her on. Her name's Dr. Kaja Rowell. If you are interested in looking her up, she's on social media and has great content. Do you have many parents of teens in the program, or is it really geared for younger ages? I would say like 20% is teens. Like, I've had parents who have children who are between 20 and 35, right? So it's like the concepts will apply. I do a lot of examples from my own life, but I also bring in anonymized examples from coaching and I have worked with a fair number of families with teens. So it's not like they have to be between a certain age. So it's both. The concepts will apply either way. I did examples in the teaching modules of both age groups, and I have hired, again, the wonderful Donna Georgian, who is an expert in teen expressions, who will be in the community with you guys. Yeah. Okay, it looks like I got everybody's questions. I'm so happy to have you all here, and it was great being with you. This is a long one, but it was my second to last live in the Clarity Workshop series for the Paradigm Shift program, which, if you're on the wait list, it will open on Wednesday at noon Eastern. I hope to see you there. I'm excited. And if you do want to guarantee access, if you do want to guarantee your spot, I would recommend joining the wait list using the link in my bio. All right, everybody, have a good day. Bye.